graphically, um, you really wouldn't think it was going to do much, yeah, for the time period. But that's not really what happened. Russia winds up becoming this massive empire. And, you guys know Russia's a big country, believe it or not. Um, we're going to go and talk about eastward expansion, westward expansion, and then some generalities for Russia, experiencing Russia, that section in the book, like, what it was like for the people that lived there. And then we're going to go over some stuff that the book doesn't talk about. So, eastward expansion wise, the Russians were super afraid of nomadic peoples. And at this time, they do exist. So, because they just like come out of the Mongols, like Mongol rule, the Russians were like terrified of nomadics. So they decided to expand outwards towards the east into Siberia and towards the south. And this ends up in them eventually like rubbing shoulders with China. They start eyeing the grasslands and the plains. Um, Going into Siberia, they find probably the biggest thing we're going to find for Russia economically, and that's going to be animal pelts. They called it soft gold. And animal pelts saw a huge increase in economic value because what was happening at this time period that was brought on by the Great Dying. Is it's the Little Ice Age. So the Little Ice Age made the world colder, and that increased European desire for animal pelts. And turns out Siberia has a ton of furry animals that are used to living in the cold. And that made a very fine export for Russia, which probably becomes its biggest economic thing. Um, in Siberia, do you guys know what Siberia is like?
It's cold.
Renzo.
Pink.
Okay, yeah, it's cold.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, it's cold. It's dry. There's not much there. There's a lot of forest. It's kind of just a big cold wasteland. It's gross. Nobody likes it. Um, except for the Russians, I guess. There were some people living there, but nobody really decided to make a state. They were basically just like tribes of Slavic people that were chilling out in the middle of this big wasteland. And they lived in their groups. They did their whole nomadic tribe thing. They'd move from place to place. You guys know how pastoral societies work by now. And the Russian military, who were organized, who had a ton of technological advancements, um, and we're just better equipped to start killing people. Did a really good job pushing into Siberia, and it led to a large amount of people dying. But it also means that like those Slavic tribes did not stand a chance in comparison to Russia. That's really the only real resistance they meet there. But they go in, and there are some Siberian people. The only thing they really care about there is fur. There's honestly not much to talk about for Siberia, other than the similarities to Spain and the Yasuk. Yasuk, do you guys know what Yasuk is? So Yasuk is a form of
No.
tribute. Oh, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say no, but that seems beside the point now.
So Yasuk was a form of tribute that was demanded particularly from the Siberians. Um, and believe it or not, but they wanted them to pay it in furs. Um, Yeah, they just made them give them a ton of furs. So Russia goes in, they take over Siberia, they bring in a bunch of diseases. Smallpox and malaria wind up killing a ton of people there. Um, and let's see. Yeah, they tried to spread Christianity, which that happens. This is where we see a lot of our similarity to Spain, um, because they did like do the whole thing. Hey, we went in here for wealth to spread God and to just be cool. But the economic gain from the furs in the Siberian region contributed largely to recovering Russia from like that period in which they kind of just sucked after the Mongols. Because the big things for Russia that you have to know are that after the Mongols, like the rest of Europe has been really just popping off. Like they have the technology to be able to sail across the Atlantic into the Americas. And Russia's just kind of this big group of dudes that they had horses and they had furs and maybe they had some guns, but like they were not that technologically or socially advanced yet because of the time that they had spent being ruled by the Mongols. So the big thing for Russia is that you have to be conscious of the fact that these guys are constantly playing catch up. Like they're looking over to Western Europe, that's what we're going to talk about next, and they see like a ton of advancement. They see that they're second best. It'd be like if I decided to join theater. It'd be like if I was Russia and Guy would be the rest of Europe. Like everybody here knows that Guy is going to outact.
Yeah, I would. Come watch Addams Family, January 27th to 29th.
But we will be there, Guy. Thank you so much.
Yes, you will. You will.
We will.
Love you, Charles.
I love you too, Guy. Yeah, Russia's second best, and they don't like that because who likes to be second best? They wind up making a lot of the native peoples in Siberia swear an oath of eternal submission to the Grand Tsar, the king of the Russians. And, that's just like more similarity to Spain. While I am comparing it a lot to what does happen with the Americas, it was nowhere near the scale of what happens. There's no like real substantial great dying. It's basically just like a bunch of Siberian dudes got the smallpox and died. It's not like a huge genocide that we see in America. To incentivize the spread of Christianity in Siberia, they gave tax breaks, exemptions from paying tributes, and I don't know, pieces of land. Not anything substantial. Like a lot of the things that we're going to see, particularly with Russian interaction with Siberia, is pretty predictable. Like, think about what happens in the Americas, tone it down a lot, and that's pretty much what happens in Russia. There's no real Columbian exchange. It's just the fur. It's pretty minimal. Some differences to what happens with Spain is that like Russia was much more economically minded. They didn't really care about spreading Christianity as much as the Spanish did. Sure, they wanted all the Siberians to convert, but like they weren't going to sacrifice money for it. The big notable thing with Russia, the big difference, is that while the Spanish did like the whole social classes thing, where like you had the Creoles and you had the Peninsulares and like all the like racial groups, with all the mixed race people. Russians were not about that. The Russians were like, yeah, you're a Russian now. And the people were like, yeah, we're Russians now. There's a very unique Russian identity that happens where they're like, yep, this is Russia, we are Russians. Um, there's no real ethnic groupy type thing that happens. It talks about Catherine the Great. Who knows what Catherine the Great is? Okay. Catherine the Great is a monarch who ruled from 1762 to 1796. She marries a mentally disabled king, the grandson of another ruler that I'm about to talk about. And she was a very successful ruler. She expanded autocratic rule. Um, she led to a large Europeanization of Russia. So while in Russia we see a Russianization of non-Russian people that get conquered, after we see them doing that to the non-Russians, we see the main Russians, the people that are conquering these other people, looking to the West and going, "Oh shoot, we're really behind," and then trying to Europeanize. They adopt a lot of European culture, and they abandon some pretty distinctly Russian things. What's up?
Who was the ruler that took over all of Siberia and shit? You said his name, but I can get it written down.
Um, the people that take Siberia, I'm pretty sure it's like Peter the Great, Catherine, and there are some other rulers that I'm about to go over. Peter the Great and Catherine are the big emperors. So these are people that rule afterwards.
So
What
was
happens
Peter,
in Russia?
was
What?
Peter like the last notable emperor before Catherine, or is he after her?
Catherine comes after Peter.
Okay, so Peter was like a big role in Siberia and like the Russianization of Siberia, and then Catherine
Ah,
westernized
okay.
Russia.
I'm going to go back to the start because I feel like I did this poorly.
Oh no, don't do that because of me. I feel like I was just like not.
No. Here, don't worry about it because like I did it. I did actually do it poorly. What
Okay,
happens in
sorry.
Russia? Russia starting. No, don't worry about it, bro. Russia starts in the 1300s. What's up? Here, give me a sec. All right, all is good. Russia starts in the 1300s, with Moscow being the tax center for the Mongols. This guy called Ivan III, he leads a movement to free Russia from the Mongols. They gain independence in 1480. Do you guys have that? Tell me when you guys are good. This is the very start of it. 1300s, Moscow is owned by the Mongols. In 1480, a guy called Ivan III frees Russia and makes it Russia. Somebody give me a confirmation that you have that. Okay. Russia's kind of trashed because the Mongols didn't really put this whole big emphasis on food. And it leads to Russia playing catch up with the rest of Europe. Ivan goes and marries the niece of the last Byzantine emperor and therefore claims control over the Orthodox Church. It winds up making Russia the third Rome. Okay. That Ivan dies. Ivan the Third the guy that decides to make Russia the third Rome, he dies. We get another Ivan. They're easy to get mixed up. Basically, the way that you can remember the Ivans is that the Ivan that came after Ivan the Third, his name is Ivan the Fourth. He's known as Ivan the Terrible. He's garbage Ivan. He's, the trash Ivan. 1533 to 1584. That's his lifespan. What he does is he expands the empire and suppresses nomadic tribes and the boyars. Boyars were Russian nobles in the bureaucracy, and he basically just became more of an autocrat. At this time, a lot of Siberia, which Russia does not own, is Islamic. What he does is he takes a bunch of peasants and he tells those peasants to go and populate that land. He also decides to go out and do some military stuff. They decide to start pushing into Siberia and taking it militarily. So they're sending Russian peasants out to go populate Siberia, and they're also taking over a lot of the Siberian tribes. These Siberian tribes get sick with Russian diseases, European diseases, and even more of them die. Okay. Russia, up until this point, has been the bitch of the Mongols. They're way behind the rest of Western Europe. So what they do is they look to Western Europe, they start to increase trade, they send out emissaries, diplomats, people like that, and they start importing artisans. We're going to link back to what I talked about beforehand with Russian expansionism into the east. Remember the Yasik, the form of tribute which was taken from the Siberians, and the main economic staple, which was fur. The big important fur was a fur called sable. Does anyone know what sable is? Sable is a pelt from an animal called a marten, and it's basically just a weird Russian ferret. Okay? They did the spread of Christianity, and that whole Russian state thing. A tool you can use to remember all European expansionism. This is a very general rule, but it works. It's the 3 Gs. Okay, this works for America too. When they ask why the Europeans went to conquer America, this is going to be your answer: God, glory, and gold. Okay. Preston, why did Spain conquer the Americas? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, he typed it in chat. He can't
Oh, he
speak
did?
because he can't put a mic. Yeah.
Damn that stuff. Yeah, it's God, glory, and gold. Okay, thank you, bro. I will keep that in mind. They did the whole Christianity incentivization thing, but the Russians were put more emphasis on the glory and the gold part. That's about it for Eastern Europe. Let me check the book to see if there's anything. Oh yeah, okay. I mentioned the fact that Ivan let's see which Ivan it was. Yeah, Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, sent out Russian peasants to go and populate Siberia. A bit more detail on that. is what they did was, shoot, I have some numbers for you guys. By 1720, 700,000 Russians lived in Siberia, reducing the native Siberian population to 30% of the total population. So they went from being the only people that lived there to only 30% of the population. And this was critical to the Russian dominance and the integration of Siberia into Russia and the spread of Russian culture. The big difference between the Russian Empire and the British and the Spanish empires that we see is defined at the end of the chapter by this one historian. And it's basic. He's like, Britain had an empire, Russia was an empire. Because where, say, Spain went in and they conquered the natives and they ruled them from way far off, the Russians ruled themselves. And this is shown because a lot of the Siberian population, they weren't actually Siberians. They were Russians who were sent to live there by Ivan the Terrible. This is, the big thing for that section. The other thing is that, like, Russia expanding into Siberia leads to the total destruction of nomadic peoples. Up until this point, what had been the big issue for a lot of agricultural-based empires? China struggles with it, Russia struggles with it, the Abbasid Empire struggles with it. Somebody give it to me. Okay. It's nomadic peoples. Peoples that, largely used horseback. We're thinking of the Mongols, things like that. People that use that means of harassing empires' borders. Russia taking over all this area, like landmass in Siberia, and the steppe in Asia largely stops this. Because what they did was, these Russians go in, right, and they populate Siberia. Siberia is currently being lived in, pre-Russian population. Siberia is inhabited by nomadic peoples. They're not doing farming. So when you send all these Russians in here, they're not going to live like the Siberians. They're going to live like Russians. So what they do is they start farming. Well, this leads to a loss of hunting grounds and a loss of pasture land because these agricultural settlers go in and they make their homestead or their city or whatever, and they turn all this pasture land into farm and all this hunting ground into farm or city. So now these nomadic peoples, they can't maintain their lifestyles anymore. They're forced to abandon nomadicism. And those who don't abandon nomadicism wind up actually having to pay fees to obtain permission to cross agricultural lands. And these nomadic peoples are largely called Cossacks, not Cossacks. Cossacks are in Western Europe. Cossacks are in the East. A difference that we see between Russia and Spain is that there wasn't really all that much of a substantial mixed race population, and they did the whole one common Russian identity thing. Are you guys good on that section of Russia? Like Russia in the East? Okay, does anybody have any questions about that? Is anyone confused about anything? Nope. Awesome. Okay. We're going to talk about Russia and the West now, and then we're going to move into the Asian empires. Um, Russia looks over to the West and they say, "Oh shoot, we are really behind." But we have a decent empire now. We've got the furs, and we have everything that we could need to become a big empire. But we're culturally just not there yet. So we see the expansion of our emperors. This is when we're going to stop referring to them as czar. We're going to start calling them emperors. Peter the Great, 1689 to 1725, goes, okay, I'm going to start making a program that's going to modernize Russia. He makes 4 big changes. Okay, these are important. He makes changes to the government. He modernizes the military. He upgrades all their weapons. He upgrades their uniforms. He makes them more Western. He improves the education system. And they expand manufacturing capabilities. This is about to be in the Industrial Revolution. Okay, 1700s. We're about to start the Industrial Revolution, and when we start talking about the 1800s, which we do during this period, it's going to make a lot of sense as to why they choose to do this with the factories, because it leads to them being able to produce exponentially more than they would have been able to otherwise. And it's just a big part of the modernization. Or the effort to modernize Russia. They did some stuff with like the Russian government. The book talks about how Russian nobles were made to shave their beards. I think it's funny that they devote like a whole sentence to that, but a bigger deal, other than shaving beards, is the fact that they make a new city in an effort to modernize and to westernize Russia. St. Petersburg, I'm sure you guys have all heard of St. Petersburg. It's called Russia's window to the West. Catherine the Great is the next notable successor to Peter. And, she does a lot of stuff. What she does is she seizes power from her disabled husband. He gets put in power by Peter the Great's kid, or I don't know, one of his family members. I don't know the exact details. And, he just kind of sucked. Catherine the Great wasn't initially Russian. She was a European who marries disabled guy and says, no, Russia is now going to be part of the European Enlightenment. And they decide to just focus on the catch-up effort. The big difference between Russia and other European powers is that they're interacting with Asia. Like, hey guys, are Russians Europeans or Asians? Or do you guys not know? Tyler, are Russians Europeans or Asians? Guy, are Russians Europeans or Asians?
Europeans. Eastern Europe.
Okay. Guy says Europeans. But, like, what about all those Russians that are like in the Asian part of Russia.
I probably call those ones Asians.
Yeah, see, so there's no real European or Asian identity. They're their own thing. They're Slavic.
Yeah.
And a difference between Russia and Europe that our book talks about is that like they have this identity crisis where they're like, are we Asians or are we Europeans? And apparently they had this big thing for like 300 years trying to figure out what they were. And in the end, they were basically just like, we're Russians. So, yeah, they were a militarized state. They conquered Siberia. They westernized under Catherine the Great and under, shoot, Peter, Peter the Great. Peter the Great comes before Catherine. The people that come before Catherine or the people that come before Peter are the Ivans, Ivan the Fourth and Ivan the Third. Ivan the Third liberates Russia. Ivan the Fourth expands it. Peter the Great industrializes it. Catherine the Great intellectualizes it. Okay? Catherine the Great's all about the Enlightenment and trying to become Europe. Okay? Does that make sense? Awesome. For a lot of the time, they viewed Russia as backwards. That's a thing that our book talks about over and over again. But whatever. Yeah, that's all our book says about Russia. I'm gonna move on to the Asian empires. What do you guys think? Do you guys have any questions?
Maybe talk about how, like the trade between Spain and Asia after Spain got access to the Atlantic. Like they traded a lot with China, right? After like getting all that silver.
I think that's
From
in
the,
the Asian empires section, isn't it?
yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna hit that, unless that's something that like Cinco talks about in class that I missed. And if that's the case, I haven't been there. I'm gonna try and keep this short. Do you guys have any questions about the Russians? Okay. For the Asian empires, we're gonna go China, Mughal, Ottomans. These are three empires all of these empires, they're all important that we get this whole unit as a chapter, like just one chapter and not two, because these are all empires which eventually become modern countries. Like, if we look at the borders for China in the Qing dynasty, it's essentially modern China. Um, if you look, like, if you think about the Ottomans, they fought in World War One. If we look at the Mughal Empire, let me pull up the Mughal Empire. They give us an early window into like the interactions between Islam and Hinduism, which lead to the formation of Pakistan. The big thing with this unit is that it lays the groundwork for a lot of the things which are big in the modern era. You guys aren't concerned about being taken over by Mongolians or by a cruise. Like, you guys aren't worried about the Crusades happening again. But like Have any of you ever been worried about nuclear war breaking out between Pakistan and India? Like, I don't know. I don't know if you guys think about that, but that's like a thing that could happen. That's just they're both nuclear superpowers and they have a ton of tension. That all links back to right now, like what we're talking about in the moment. That's why this is important. And that's why it gives it a unit. So moving into that section, we're going to talk about Qing Dynasty China. Basically, China cucks itself after disbanding Zheng He's fleet in 1433. And they're like, damn, that sucks. Or we're like, damn, that sucks for them. But they wind up with an empire anyways, because the Qing dynasty comes from the Manchu people. It starts in 1644 and goes till 1912. That's tangible. Like, 1912 is way closer than the 1600s. Yeah. There's a Manchurian takeover of China. They were nomadic peoples who wind up settling down, and they make a big empire out of China. It's if you guys look at a map of modern China, it's pretty much the same thing. And they they start stimulating trade. They make an 8-year military effort to expand China, Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Those are the 3 regions which wind up getting expanded out to. Those are all to the left of like the big Chinese state that's almost always China for all of time, and make up like the Central Asia side of China. Let's get some insights. Pause for a second. If China has taken over Mongolia and that area of the steppe, and Russia's taken over Siberia and the northern area of the steppe, what's the Silk Road sitting on? This is a trick question. This guy, what's up?
Is it like Chinese land now?
It's now like, it's just regulated by both of these empires.
Okay.
They're no longer nomadic peoples because the empires control all that area and are populating it.
Did that impact trade negatively? Whoa. I was like,
No. It actually impacted it positively. So y'all remember how like they only traded on the Silk Road like super expensive goods?
Yeah.
Well, that was back when ship technologies were ass.
Mm-hmm.
Now that they've been like upgrading ships and stuff, there's no real need to trade on the Silk Road. It's that silk, the technology for making silk has spread outside of China. The secret is out. Now anybody can make silk, and so the Silk Road loses relevance. This is another big thing with this chapter. Chapter 5 is when we see the Silk Road die. Chapter 5 is when we see the nomadic peoples rescind. Chapter 5 is when we see the formation of empires, which will impact modern society, and the groundwork laying for like modern politics. So the Silk Road is no more. The Indian trade routes are what are. The Indian Ocean trade routes are what's in. The Qing take over that area of land. They conquer the Mongols. It's over in 1689. And that pretty much ends the period of Qing expansion. That's really all it gives us. It talks about how they like it moves on and it talks about like they didn't really do this whole assimilation thing. Typically, when we see empires like say Spain or like Russia come in, they came in, they conquered all the people in the steppe, and they were like, "You are Russian now." China didn't really do that. They took over the areas that they took over, and they basically just like let the cultures that were already in the region just chill out. The Qing government wound up incorporating like people from Mongolia, Tibetans, and they had like people from like the Islamic cultures that are in Xinjiang, and that's cool. Buddhists wind up getting excused from taxes in their monasteries, and they weren't forced into the labor service. And China didn't do the whole thing that Russia did, where they were like, "Yes, Russian people, go populate Siberia." Um, Instead, they were just like, "Hey, you guys can live in your land. We just control it now." They didn't send Chinese settlers to flood the area and take it over. Um, they actually tried to restrict Chinese culture. In Mongolia, the Qing restrict Chinese merchants and immigrants so that they could preserve like the Mongolian fighting spirit from soft Chinese civilization. Which, it's a little bit racist, but it's cool that they didn't colonize them. And they did that because they wanted to use the Mongolians as like the main source for the military. Yeah, that's the thing with the Qing and like cultural expansion stuff like that. They were pretty chill about how they interacted with those people. Um, there are the obvious differences between Russia that I talked about. Yeah, it kills the Silk Road. It kills nomadic people, or it doesn't actually kill nomadic people. It forces them into cities. Um, yeah, this section on the Qing ends with eliminated permanently as a major actor on the historical stage, the nomadic pastoralists who had been the strongest alternative to settled agricultural society since the second millennium. It was the end of a long era. And that's the end of the section. Do you guys have any questions about the Qing? Is there anything you're confused about? Okay. We're going to talk about the Mughals now. Yeah. It's a big interactive period between Islam and Hinduism. What happens is that Islamic Turks who claim descendants from Genghis Khan and some other nomadic guys came in to India and conquered it all. And from 1526 to 1707, the Mughal state rules. All of these empires attain a lot of their power, the Russians, the Chinese, the Mughals, through the use of gunpowder. That's just a notable thing about them. They're called the gunpowder empires. Um, yeah, the government was Islamic. There was a big division between Mughal India. It was that 20% of the population were Muslims. They were the people that were in charge, and pretty much everybody else practiced some form of Hinduism. It talks about two emperors for what we call. We have Akbar, and then we have this other guy, and he just sucks. His name is like Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb. I don't know, man. Akbar is the good guy. We like Akbar. We don't like Aurangzeb. Akbar rules from 1556 to 1605, and he was like, well, shit. I can't be super oppressive towards Hindus because we're literally only 20% of the population. Um, I'm going to do what I can to quell Hindu rebellion, but I'm also going to be super accommodative of it. What he winds up doing is he quells like the biggest of the warrior-based Hindu tribes, the Rajputs in northwest India, and he marries a couple of their like daughters or whatever. But he doesn't force them to convert to Islam. Um, he incorporates a lot of Hindus into the government, into the political military elite. He allows for the building and supports the building of Hindu temples and mosques. Um, he actually does a lot of stuff for women. He softens restrictions on Hindu women. He allows for remarriage and discourages child marriages. He also gets rid of this, or like, he discourages this practice called sati. Does anybody know what sati is? Sati was basically a Hindu practice in which a widow would fling herself onto the funeral pyre of her husband, essentially burning herself to death. And Akbar is basically just like, hey, maybe don't do that. He doesn't outright forbid it, but he's like, hey, maybe this isn't cool. Um, they actually allow some women to become like politically powerful. It gives one example, Nur Jahan, who's the favorite wife of Akbar's successor. Um, her husband was a bit of a dick. Akbar's successor. His name was like Emperor Jahangir. He rules from 1605 to 1627, and he was an opium addict, an alcohol addict. He kind of just sucked, and his wife pretty much ruled for him. Going back to Akbar, it talks about how they did religious toleration, which is really cool. And he held back a lot of this like group of militant Islamic scholars called the ulama, and he got rid of like a lot of Islamic nations had something called a special tax or a jizya on non-Muslims, and it was basically just like, hey, if you're not a Muslim, you have to pay a bunch of money to the state, and he got rid of that. He made a big house of worship, and this house of worship doesn't have any denomination. They What he does was he gets Muslims, Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Jewish people, Jains, Zoroastrians, and all these other religions, and he has them discuss religious matters. So it's a big period of religious interaction and freedom for a lot of people, and was very important. This is when we're avoiding conflict between Hindus and Islam and Muslims. There was large interaction between Persians, or like Persian culture and Indian culture, and it was pretty good. But not everything was chill. Not everything was cool with the homies. Um, there were a lot of Islamic people who did not like the fact that they were being so lenient on Hindus, and they viewed it as like a negative depurification on Islam. So there's this guy, Aurangzeb. He's made emperor of the Mughal Empire in 1658 to 1707, and he basically just goes back to being super oppressive. They ban sati, they ban music and dance in court. Um, they no longer tolerate dancing or drinking or prostitution, or drug use. Basically, made it not fun. Um, and yeah, they were basically just really shitty to Hindu people, and it leads to tensions between Muslims and Hindus. And Aurangzeb dies, and it fractures the Mughal Empire. And this like big power vacuum that he leaves makes it so that like the British Empire can come in and they take over and they rule for the second half of the 18th century. And this is what leads to the conflict between Muslims and Hindus. What's up, guy?
Oh, nothing. But I'm gonna log off now because I have to do my math homework. But thanks so much. I had no idea what happened in Russia, but now I do.
Okay.
Catherine the Great, who intellectualized and westernized Russia.